A man saves an injured polar bear but then quickly blurts out heartbreaking words. The wind howled through the barren, ice-covered landscape, carrying a sharp chill that could pierce through even the thickest of furs. Ethan Carter tightened his coat around his broad shoulders, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air. This was just another day in the desolate Arctic wilderness, the place he had called home for nearly a decade. Once, Ethan had been a renowned wildlife researcher. He had spent years studying the very creatures that roamed these lands, polar bears, wolves, seals, until tragedy struck. A brutal storm had taken away the two people he loved most in the world, his wife Anna and their daughter Lily. One wrong turn, one miscalculation in the face of a raging blizzard, and they were gone. Since that day, Ethan had walked away from the world, retreating into the cold embrace of solitude. He built a small cabin on the edge of the Arctic Sea, where he lived alone, surviving by fishing and hunting. His only companions were the distant cries of seabirds and the occasional glimpse of a wolf prowling along the ice. That morning, as Ethan rowed his small wooden boat across the frozen waters, his keen eyes spotted something unusual in the distance. At first, it seemed like just another chunk of floating ice, but as he drew closer, his heart clenched. It was moving. Ethan squinted against the blinding reflection of the sun on the ice. A small creature clung desperately to a drifting slab of ice, barely holding on. It was only when he got within a few feet that he saw what it really was. A polar bear cub. Ethan's first instinct was caution. Polar bears were apex predators, the rulers of this frozen domain. Even a young one no larger than a husky could be dangerous. If its mother was nearby, Ethan was already dead. She would rip him apart before he even had a chance to react. But there was no sign of her. Ethan scanned the icy expanse, his heart pounding. No massive paw prints, no hulking white figure lurking in the distance. The cub was alone. It wasn't just alone. It was dying. The little bear's ribs were visible beneath its thick fur, its breathing shallow and weak. It must have been floating on that ice for days, stranded, abandoned, or worse, orphaned. Ethan hesitated. Taking in a wild animal was dangerous, insane even. The cub could grow into a predator that wouldn't think twice about killing him. But then it looked at him. Its eyes weren't wild with aggression. They were dull, filled with an exhaustion deeper than hunger. Ethan had seen those eyes before, in the mirror. Sighing heavily, he reached out and grabbed the ice slab, pulling it toward the boat. "All right, kid, you're coming with me." The cub didn't resist. It was too weak to fight back. As Ethan lifted it into the boat, it didn't even growl, just curled into a tight ball, trembling from cold and fatigue. As he rowed back toward the cabin, Ethan felt a strange knot in his chest. It had been a long time since he had shared his space with another living being. He just hoped he wasn't making a mistake. The first challenge was getting the cub to eat. Ethan wrapped it in an old fur blanket, setting it near the cabin's small, crackling fireplace. He placed a bowl of thawed fish beside it, then stepped back. The cub didn't move. It lay there, its tiny frame rising and falling with each slow breath. "Come on, kid," Ethan muttered, crouching down beside it. "You gotta eat." The bear opened one eye, flicking its gaze toward the fish, but didn't budge. It didn't trust him yet. Smart. Ethan sighed, standing up. "Fine. Starve if you want." He walked away, giving the cub space. Hours passed. The Arctic sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Ethan sat at his worn wooden table, sipping a steaming cup of coffee, keeping one eye on the small creature near the fire. Then, in the silence of the cabin, he heard it. A quiet shuffle. Turning his head slightly, he saw the cub inch forward. It sniffed the fish once, twice. Then, finally it took a cautious bite. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good. That's a start. For the first few days, the cub barely moved. It slept for long hours, only waking to eat and drink water. Ethan didn't push it. He knew the rule of wild animals. Let them come to you, never the other way around. But slowly, the bear began to adjust. It started exploring the cabin, sniffing around the furniture, occasionally bumping into things. One time, it tried to chew on Ethan's old boots, earning it a stern glare. "Hey, those cost me a fortune," The bear blinked at him, then continued gnawing. Ethan shook his head. Fine, do what you want. Over time, he found himself talking to the cub more. Maybe it was out of habit, maybe it was just the loneliness catching up to him. You remind me of someone, he muttered one night, watching the cub sleep near the fire. Someone stubborn. The cub twitched an ear. I guess I should call you something, huh? He leaned back in his chair, thinking. How about Nanook? It means polar bear in Inuit. The cub didn't react, but Ethan smirked anyway. Yeah, that suits you, Nanook. It had a nice ring to it. As the days passed, Nanook became stronger. The fragile, half-starved cub began to fill out, its fur growing thick and glossy. It no longer hesitated before eating and even started to follow Ethan around the cabin, watching him with curious eyes. One morning, as Ethan was splitting firewood, something unexpected happened. He had just lifted the axe when he heard a soft thud behind him. Turning around, he saw Nanook sitting there watching him work. Enjoying the show? Ethan smirked. Nanook cocked its head, then, to Ethan's surprise, it clumsily smacked a small log with its paw. Ethan froze. A slow chuckle rumbled from his chest. What, you want to help? Nanook smacked the log again, looking up at Ethan expectantly. He couldn't help but laugh. This bear was ridiculous. All right, kid, Ethan said, tossing a smaller log toward Nanook. You split that one. I'll handle the rest. Of course, the bear didn't actually split the log. Instead, it chewed on it for a few minutes before losing interest. But the moment stayed with Ethan. Nanook was learning. More importantly, Nanook trusted him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Companionship. Ethan didn't like to think about the future. He knew what Nanook was, a wild animal. Someday the bear would grow too big, too strong. Someday it would need to go back to the wilderness where it belonged. But for now, Nanook was here. For now, Ethan wasn't alone. And in this vast frozen world, that meant everything. Winter in the Arctic was relentless, but inside Ethan's cabin, warmth flickered in more ways than one. As the weeks passed, Nanook grew strong, its once fragile frame filling out with thick muscle and dense fur. What had once been a shivering, half-starved cub was now a formidable young bear. Ethan had never intended to raise a polar bear. In fact, he had expected the cub to leave once it regained its strength. But Nanook stayed. It followed Ethan wherever he went, out to the fishing holes, to the woodpile, even down the coastline where the sea met the frozen tundra. At first, Ethan tried to keep some distance. He reminded himself over and over that Nanook was not a pet. It was still a wild animal, and one day it would have to return to the wild. But the line between wild and domestic blurred with every passing day. One afternoon, while Ethan was preparing a fresh catch of fish, he noticed Nanook pacing near the door. The bear had grown restless, sniffing the air and letting out soft, impatient grunts. Ethan knew exactly what it meant. "You want to go outside, huh?" he muttered, wiping his hands. "Fine, but don't go causing trouble." Nanook didn't need an invitation twice. As soon as Ethan opened the door, the bear charged into the open, kicking up snow as it bounded toward the frozen shore. Ethan followed at a distance, watching as Nanook rolled onto its back, wiggling in the snow like an overgrown puppy. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. "Damn bear," he murmured, shaking his head. It was in moments like these that Ethan forgot his initial fears. He forgot that this was an animal capable of growing into a predator that could kill with a single swipe. He forgot that he was alone in this vast, frozen world. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't. But the illusion of safety shattered as quickly as it had formed. One evening, as Ethan sat by the fire, carving the handle of an old knife, he heard a sound that immediately set him on edge. A deep, guttural growl. It wasn't the playful grumble Nanook sometimes made when it wanted food. This was something else, something primal. Ethan turned and his breath caught in his throat. Nanook stood in the dim candlelight, its massive frame blocking the doorway. Its shoulders were tense, its ears flattened against its skull. Its eyes, once filled with curiosity and trust, were narrowed, dark, and unreadable. For the first time, Ethan truly saw what Nanook was becoming. Not a cub, not a pet, a predator. And in that moment, for the first time since bringing Nanook home, Ethan felt something he had not expected. Fear. The low growl rumbled through the cabin, vibrating against the wooden walls like distant thunder. Ethan's grip tightened around the knife handle he had been carving, though he knew it would be useless if Nanook decided to attack. The bear stood at the doorway, massive and imposing, its shoulders rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The flickering firelight cast eerie shadows over its thick white fur, making it look almost ghostly. Ethan remained still, his instincts screaming at him to not make any sudden movements. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "It's just me." Nanook's ears twitched at the sound, but its muscles remained tense. The bear's deep brown eyes, once filled with a familiar warmth, were now clouded with something Ethan didn't like. Hunger, instinct, wildness. Ethan had always known this moment would come. Nanook was no longer the fragile cub he had rescued from the ice. It had grown taller than Ethan when it stood on its hind legs, heavier than 3 men combined. It had outgrown the space inside the cabin, outgrown the small world Ethan had built for it. The silence between them stretched. Ethan could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows, but all his focus remained on the bear. Then, slowly, Nanook took a step forward. Ethan tensed. The bear's breath was hot, visible in the cold air as it exhaled. Another step. Its claws scraped lightly against the wooden floor. Too close. Ethan swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "You're testing me, aren't you?" Nanook blinked. Its ears twitched again. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had built, the bear let out a heavy sigh and turned away. Ethan exhaled, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen slightly. Nanook lumbered toward the fire, flopping down with a loud huff. The moment of danger had passed. For now. But Ethan knew better than to ignore what had just happened. The following days were different. Nanook still followed Ethan outside, still rolled in the snow and chased after fish when Ethan cast his lines. But something had shifted. The bear wasn't as playful anymore. It spent more time staring at the horizon, toward the vast expanse of ice stretching beyond the shore. It began wandering farther during their outings, sometimes disappearing from Ethan's sight for hours before returning. The distance between them was growing. One evening, as Ethan skinned a fresh seal he had caught, he noticed Nanook watching him, not the way it used to, not with curiosity, with intent. Ethan held the knife a little tighter. "You thinking of taking this from me?" he asked. Nanook didn't move. Ethan tossed a chunk of meat toward the bear, watching as it snapped it up with sharp efficiency. The way Nanook tore into the flesh, the way its powerful jaws crunched through bone, Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. This was not the small cub he had once nursed back to health. This was a full-grown predator. And sooner or later, instinct would win. Ethan sat by the fire that night, staring at the flickering flames, lost in thought. For months, he had told himself that he could keep Nanook here, that their bond was different, that the bear saw him as family. But tonight, for the first time, Ethan wondered if he had been lying to himself. Nanook was restless because it wasn't meant to be here anymore. He had given it warmth, food, companionship, but he had also taken away its true nature. Out there, beyond the ice, a real life awaited, a life of hunting, roaming, surviving on its own. Ethan glanced toward the bear. Nanook was curled near the door, but its ears were twitching, its body shifting even in sleep. Dreaming of the wild. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew what he had to do. It was time to let Nanook go. The next morning, Ethan packed a bag with supplies. He didn't need much, just enough for the journey ahead. Nanook watched him, its large head tilting slightly. When Ethan opened the door, the bear hesitated. Normally, it would have rushed outside without a second thought. But today was different. Ethan stepped out first, letting the cold air sting his skin. The morning sky was grey, the ice beneath his boots stretching endlessly toward the horizon. He turned back toward the bear. "Come on, Nanook," he said softly. "Let's go." For a moment, the bear just stood there, staring at Ethan as if it understood what was happening. Then, without a sound, it followed. They walked for hours, moving farther and farther away from the cabin, deeper into the frozen wilderness. Ethan didn't look back. He knew he wouldn't be returning, not yet. Nanook led the way now, its nose high in the air, sniffing for something only it could scent. They walked past towering cliffs of ice, through valleys of untouched snow, until finally they reached the edge of the sea ice. Ethan stopped. Nanook did too. For a long time, neither of them moved. The ice creaked beneath their feet, the distant call of seabirds echoing in the cold wind. Then Ethan took a deep breath. "This is it, buddy." Nanook turned to look at him, its deep brown eyes locking onto Ethan's, and in that moment, Ethan saw the truth. Nanook wasn't lost. Nanook wasn't abandoned. It was home. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a small smile. "Go on, then." Nanook didn't move at first. It simply stood there, watching him, as if waiting for some final word, some reassurance that everything would be okay. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the bear turned away. And it walked. Ethan watched as Nanook's massive form disappeared into the white expanse, blending into the ice, becoming part of the wild once more. He stood there long after the bear was gone, the cold biting at his skin, his breath heavy in the frozen air. Then, finally, he turned and started the long walk home. Alone. But for the first time in a long, long time, he knew it was the right thing to do. The cabin felt different without Nanook. Ethan had always lived alone, had always preferred the silence of the Arctic. But now, the quiet felt heavier, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He had spent months convincing himself that letting Nanook go was the right decision, that the bear belonged to the wild. And yet, every time he stepped outside, his eyes instinctively searched the horizon, hoping to see a familiar shape moving across the ice. Days turned into weeks. Ethan kept himself busy, fishing, chopping wood, repairing parts of the cabin that had been battered by the elements. But at night, sitting by the fire, he found himself glancing toward the door, half expecting to hear the familiar thud of heavy paws against the wooden floor. One evening, as Ethan stood by the shoreline, watching the ice shift with the tide, he noticed tracks. Fresh, massive paw prints in the snow. His breath caught. They were unmistakable. His pulse quickened as he followed the tracks. They led inland, weaving between ice ridges and snow-covered rocks. The further he walked, the more a strange feeling grew in his chest. Hope, fear, anticipation, all tangled together. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A lone figure stood atop a frozen ridge, silhouetted against the fading light. Broad shoulders, thick fur, familiar stance. Nanook. The bear was different now. Larger, stronger, fully adapted to the wild, but as Ethan took a cautious step forward, Nanook turned and for a moment their eyes met. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Nanook didn't move at first. Then, slowly, it took a step forward, not out of hesitation, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The wild had claimed Nanook, but some part of him still remembered. Ethan smiled. Some bonds, no matter how improbable, could never truly be broken. Ethan stood frozen in place, his breath visible in the cold air. Nanook stood just a few yards away, massive and unyielding, his thick fur dusted with ice. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of the sea and distant memories. Ethan wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe that Nanook would ignore him, fully embracing his wild nature, or maybe that the bear would turn and disappear into the tundra, severing the last fragile connection they shared. But instead, Nanook remained still, watching him. Slowly, Ethan took a step forward. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he murmured. Nanook let out a deep huff, a sound Ethan recognized. Not a growl, not a warning, but something almost familiar. Another step. Nanook didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, ears flicking in recognition. Ethan had seen that posture before, back when Nanook was just a cub curling up beside the fire. The tension in Ethan's chest eased. "You doing all right out here?" he asked, even though he knew the bear couldn't answer. Nanook took another step closer, his breath hot in the frigid air. For a moment, Ethan considered reaching out, but he knew better. Nanook wasn't that cub anymore. He was something greater, something free, And yet even with the wild claiming him, he had come back. Ethan felt something settle deep inside him, something that had been restless for a long time. He had spent years believing he was alone, pushing away the world after losing his family. But Nanak had changed that. The bear had been a reminder that even in the harshest places, companionship could still exist. The moment didn't last forever. With one last lingering look, Nanak turned. Ethan watched as the bear moved effortlessly across the ice, his massive frame blending into the endless white. He wasn't sad this time. Ethan smiled to himself, turning back toward the cabin. No, he wasn't alone. Not anymore.